Great.
Okay, so so once again, thanks again to Marta and Francesco for organising this and for inviting me. I'm going to be talking about a very different type of project to what Ola's just been talking to us about, and it was a project that's just sorry, there we go. It's just resulted in a publication of a open access book called Democracy in a Pandemic, which has been edited with I'll talk a bit more about this, the participation charity involved. And I thought it might be useful just to talk to you a little bit about the kind of the project itself as much as the outcomes of it, because I think it's useful to sort of, I think it's useful to get an understanding of a variety of sorts of ways that academics are working these days, particularly in relation to what's often known as impact and knowledge exchange and those sorts of things. So this is as much a research project as it is a sort of what's often referred to as knowledge exchange, and I'll come back to that in a second. And this is the book, as I say, it's published by Westminster University Press, and it was published a couple of months ago. So it's part of a project between the Centre for the Study of Democracy, which I direct at the University of Westminster, and as I mentioned, Involve, who are probably one of the UK's leading participation charities. They both advocate for public participation in political decision making and also run large projects. So they're very well known for running citizens' assemblies and those sorts of things. Unlike Ola's project, this was actually a very meagerly funded project and was funded internally from funds within the University of Westminster, initially through an impact grant, which was related to the research evaluation framework, and then more recently through one of our research communities. So we, as many universities do, they organise around particular themes, and the theme of diversity and inclusion gave me a small amount of funding. I think the whole project probably cost somewhere between 15 and 20 or 15 or 20,000 pounds over a year and a half. So it's really small scale. And the question that we were asking ourselves is, what role can and should participation and deliberation play in response to COVID-19? So we're both interested in capturing what was happening during COVID in relation to participation, but also what role it could play under different conditions. And the outputs were of two types for the initial project. And the first was we worked with practitioners and local authority civil servants to crowdsource some guidance on how local authorities could actually engage local communities of different sorts, communities of place, communities of interest in their COVID responses. So we were trying to show that even though we were under emergency conditions, participation could be a vital part of that. So it was kind of showing, it was a very practical guide. But we also began a blog series in May 2020. We thought it would be really helpful to offer this opportunity for different actors to present what they were finding and what they were feeling during the pandemic. And it's that blog series that eventually became the book. When we started it, we didn't expect it to become a book. So our initial blog that was posted by myself and Tim, who's the director involved, spoke even, after a couple of months, our concern within the UK about the sort of centralisation and concentration of power that was happening as a response to the emergency. And of course, certain things are required to be centralised and concentrated, but there were lots of things that were happening. We felt there were certain policy failures emerging because of the failures to engage relevant communities. And examples of this can be what I would suggest would be the late arrival, a lockdown. I would suggest the communication strategies that were used, and etc., which were very much coming from a small group of experts, politicians, and civil servants in Whitehall who were not necessarily sensitive to the needs and interests and everyday lives of certain communities. And obviously, having to react under speed. I'm not taking away any of the problems they were facing, but the tendency of the UK state, as ever, was to centralise and to concentrate power. But at the same time, of course, around the UK, we saw the emergence of mutual aid and self-help groups responding to immediate needs. We saw some public authorities, some local authorities, and some charities actively listening to and working with vulnerable communities, and not just not, you know, as part of their strategy as responding to the COVID pandemic. We were worried about the rhetoric that was very common at the time about how we were all in this together and how COVID was going to be the great leveler, and pointed out even at that time, you know, the kind of problems with that kind of language, given, you know, the extent to which certain people had vulnerable health conditions, people were engaged in risky work, whether that was health and social care or in the gig economy, the kind of loss of income that was happening to a significant proportion of the population, well-being around mental health. And then later, obviously this wasn't at that moment because we didn't have a vaccine, but later on in relation to vaccine hesitancy. And that without responding to these extensive inequalities, there was always going to be it was always going to generate a problematic politics. And our argument basically was that better and more trustworthy decision-making would be made through participation and deliberation, particularly with those communities most vulnerable during the pandemic. So with the blog series that happened in May, actually it took ages for it to take off. You know, we thought it would be, we didn't know what would happen, but we were really surprised about how slow it was. And of course, in retrospect, and at the time, we shouldn't be surprised about that, because most of the people we were trying to work with were facing crisis conditions. And so the last thing they wanted to do was write a blog. But what was really interesting was after people had a little bit more time and a little bit more opportunity to reflect, actually, there was a lot of interest. And we managed to generate over the year 35 blogs from a diverse voices of activists, practitioners, policymakers, researchers, and writers. And what we were trying to do was not to just kind of go out and collect data about these people, but actually get them to write about their experience and to write about what it was that they felt was critical. And what was really crucial in that was to identify actors who we would like to hear from, but who had no experience of public writing. So I actually worked with, for example, someone from the prisoner, from, I can't remember what the full title of it, but from the Prisoner Support Network. I worked with a couple of people, a person who organizes with the unions in the gig economy and others. And I interviewed them and then wrote what I heard, then passed it back to them for them to edit and go into a process of that. And actually, what was really nice for a lot of people was this was the first time they'd actually had a piece of writing out in the public domain. And so it's not the sort of thing I normally do. And it was really kind of, you know, I'm much more of a traditional researcher, but this struck me as a very powerful way of hearing the voices of particular communities. And our aim, what we said to them was, you know, talk to us about how participation is important, or how participation is being undermined, or how participation could be improved, etc., etc. So it was a very open brief. Oops, what's happened there? And so what we ended up with was a mix of reflections on innovative participatory practices that were happening. So there was a charity who was engaged with, who worked with people with learning disabilities, who actually actively engaged them early on in terms of trying to work out how do you provide services when you can't actually do face-to-face work. We engaged with, we had a couple of queer activists who talked about the importance of a queer house party, which was a gathering, a regular gathering of people from the queer community who, in terms of support and provision of resources. We also heard from student unions, from refugee and migrant communities who talked about how difficult it was to actually do participation. One of the a really lovely insight that came out from an actor from the migrant community who wrote for us was saying how very often he goes to participation exercises and he realizes he's often the only person who isn't paid. Everyone else there is from a civil society organization or is from public authority, and yet he's expected to give up his time, unlike these people who are doing it professionally. And there's really interesting insights about some of the structural limitations for engagement, and also examples of where participation could make a difference within particular communities. So the book, which is nice and short, that's the most important thing about it, includes the introduction, a version of the introduction that we wrote as the first blog. We then actually selected 16 of the blogs, 16 of the 35 blogs, which we present chronologically. We commissioned 5 short essays from a community activist from Manchester who was talking about hearing diverse voices, from an organisation called the Big Local, which talked about the experience of mutual aid, from somebody from New Local who talked about how some public authorities had taken a participatory approach, someone from Participedia who looked at democratic innovations around the world, and then a professor, Arkon Fung from Harvard University, who talked about his thoughts on what the pandemic meant for the future of democracy. And then Tim and I, at the end of it, wrote a kind of manifesto, a very short manifesto for democracy in crisis. Our argument being that the pandemic, we're likely to see other forms of health crises, in ecological crises and others, and that we can actually learn from this crisis. What is it that we might learn? Now, we wrote this as a manifesto. I could equally have written this as a very dry academic article, and actually I may well do, but and I may well reflect on the project. But actually, we wrote this as a sort of much more as a sort of intervention into trying to make an intervention into current politics. And so you get the book from Open Access. So what was it that we argued? The first was trying to make the case for establishing mechanisms for ongoing public dialogue, not to try and invent these during a pandemic, but actually to have them in place before we're in crisis time. Because what was clear is those authorities, those organizations that already had mechanisms for public dialogue worked better during the crisis than those that tried to, those that either drew up the bridge and kind of centralized, or those that didn't have that kind of practice in place already. So our argument was, as we come out of the crisis, establish these mechanisms, because they're a good way of doing decision making, but actually there will be a benefit for future crises. The secondly was about investment in communities. And what we mean there is investment in the sort of infrastructure of communities, things like community hubs, community centers, the kinds of resources that local charities need. And one of the really interesting insights we got from the book was from the director of Big Local, who has evidence where they are funded by the National Lottery, and they give millions of pounds to particular localities who have control over those funds. And so that's a natural experiments of those places where they had developed infrastructure, community infrastructure, and those that hadn't. And it's quite clear that those places that had things like a community center or a community hub, those things that actually had done networking amongst community groups, were in a much better place than very similar places that didn't have that infrastructure. So relatively light investment in communities it really does pay dividends. The third was clearly to tackle inequalities, because what COVID has done is expose inequalities in a way that we probably didn't recognize them before, but exacerbated them. And we actually are in a much more unequal society. And somehow we really, if we're going to tackle crises well, we need to recognize the nature of those inequalities and respond to them. We made the case for involving citizens in shaping the future. A lot of the discussions that are happening now in terms of building back better, all of these sorts of ideas and leveling up, etc. These are really happening discourses and debates that are happening at an elite level, and not involving the communities who are subject to these policies. And really in terms of thinking about how we move forward, then involving citizens is critical to that. And finally, learning lessons. We make a strong argument, falling behind a lot of other people, about the need for public inquiry. But our argument is that public inquiry needs to take the word public seriously and engage with those vulnerable communities in the kinds of ways that we've been looking in the book, to actually learn from and draw stories from the pandemic, which are firsthand rather than secondhand, and of course apply them. So just some reflections on this, because for me, this was a really different way of doing research and knowledge exchange. It was really unusual for me to work with a civil society. I mean, I do work with civil society groups, but this kind of work, which was a mixture of, I would say, activism, research, and as a researcher, being able to, as someone, being able to provide my skills to help people who wouldn't otherwise be able to voice their perspective. You know, we sometimes undervalue what we are able to offer people in that way. And you can't imagine the delight of some of the people who have appeared now, not just in a blog, but in a book, when in May 2020, they couldn't have imagined that something like that would have been possible. So I've been really pleased about this kind of, and I don't really know describe what we've been doing, but it isn't captured by sort of classic research and knowledge exchange. It's it's been a really interesting process. It's a different way of funding. I mean, I'm all for, you know, I've run million pound grants, so I've had big funding, but actually this has been one of the really important lessons for me, is this has been a really productive project, and it's had very little money. So money doesn't necessarily equate to necessarily good outputs. Thirdly, this is the first time I've done an open access book, and what's made me, I mean, it's a different kind of book as well, but the amount of people who are coming back to me saying that they have looked at the book and read the book because it was open access. Now, this is a problem when it comes to things like research evaluation frameworks, etc., because we tend to privilege, you know, the kind of Cambridge University presses and Oxford University presses and Harvard presses of this world. But actually, in terms of people reading your research, which some of us do aspire for people to read what we write, actually, we should potentially look at some of these open access opportunities. And I think for more senior people like myself, it's really important that we do actually do some of this, because, you know, early career researchers, this can be more difficult. But I think, you know, for people who are established, I think we've got to take these kinds of risks. And fourth, I think it was really an interesting way for an academic to take part in responding to the politics of the pandemics, to work with a third sector organization, and to really primarily act initially as a platform for other people to voice their perspectives, and to provide that possibility. I think was, for me, has meant that this has been one of the sort of most time consuming but entirely positive academic experiences that I've had. So I'll just leave it there. The book is available, as I say, from the University of Westminster Press. You can buy a hard copy, but you don't have to. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Graham. That was really great.